I'm Matt Gishard, and this is No Holds Barred. In this episode, we're going to talk about domestic violence. We have four special guests. We're going to have a conversation about domestic violence and the challenges faced by not just our four special guests, but anyone who's ever experienced domestic violence. We're here this evening, actually, to talk a little bit about domestic violence, or a lot about domestic violence. So just to let you, the four of you, know who I am, I'm a former deputy district attorney in Contra Costa County, and I headed the sexual assault unit back in the day, and that unit handled all domestic violence, child abuse, sexual abuse, and also have kind of a good understanding of how the system works. We do have a pretty sophisticated system nowadays. The most good-sized DA's offices have a separate domestic violence unit. Contra Costa County has a couple of people in it. We actually have a domestic violence court. And as you know, in family court, most of the time, when people appear in front of the judge initially, there is actually a restraining order. There is an order that goes out that people are not to engage in domestic violence or harassment or anything such as that. So there is a concept that this is a huge problem. The question is, in spite of that concept, in spite of the assets that are being put into it, in spite of the attention that is being brought, there are many cracks in the system, and part of what we want to discuss tonight is your understanding of how it all works and what you think we could do to make it better, because I think that's really important, is what is working, what is not working. So it's great that you have assets, it's great that we have these separate units, but I hear so often that this didn't work and that didn't work. And I often used to say in the DA's office we would get a restraining order against someone, and but that's a piece of paper. And if that person wants to commit violence, they don't care about that piece of paper. So some do, some don't. So really the question is, how do we protect people? I do all the law enforcement involved fatal incident coroner's inquests as the judge in Contra Costa County, or we call it the hearing officer. And I can't tell you the number of those law enforcement involved interactions involve domestic violence involved. That's why the police arrive at a residence, and in many cases somebody gets violent, and the next thing you know, there's a disaster. So I wanted to say a little bit about my background, just so you know, okay, he does have some background, some experience in this, and let's talk about it. I think one of the first things is really, what is domestic violence? Kind of what does that take in? And it takes in an awful lot. People, I think, just under the law think it's spouses, but it's people are living together and all that. So why don't who would like to just kind of start addressing this conversation about where we're going, and perhaps why you decided that this would be appropriate to have have this discussion. So Caitlin, let's start with you. What do you think?
Oh, what a lucky one to pick too, because I'm loud and proud about it. So, well, for starters, why I'm here, I'm someone who went through domestic violence as the victim and the survivor, as well as my daughter, for about 8-9 years. It started with different types of domestic violence: verbal, emotional, physical, even legal. So I've had all different avenues of domestic violence. I was someone who wasn't very aware of it. I think it's because I started at such a young age with this person that I wasn't even sure what domestic violence really is. I mean, at 15, you're not really sure of the world yet. And I had parents who educated me very well, but the first conversation a parent is going to have is not, this is what domestic violence looks like when your child's dating. So at that point, I don't really know anything about it, and I'm kind of blind to it. And so I fell into it with a personal partner, so an intimate partner. So my experience with domestic violence was personal, an interpersonal relationship with my partner. And so I think that after I went through this whole process, I started to meet and see other cases or other people who had been through domestic violence in different ways and
Well, let
identifying
me
it in
ask just,
different avenues.
yeah, where did that take place that you ran into it with other people? Just friends or people telling you about their own experiences?
So, friend wise, it kind of came to light afterwards because I was able to identify the red flags, if you will, the signs more so after. But personally, with my personal experience, it was in the court system. It was in the criminal court system. It was in jail. It was in a lot of other different places. My story is kind of complex, so I was able to see just
Well, let me
how.
ask you then. Yeah, were you? So I'm going to interrupt a little and what so that we can have a conversation a little bit. So occasionally I'll just say,
Of
"Well,
course.
okay, we'll let you keep talking, but there's something that came up that I want to know about." So in your experience, somebody was actually prosecuted for uh, domestic violence, and you were a victim.
So it was actually in my case, it was flipped on me. So I was the original person who had filed the restraining order. I had went to court. He had had the arrests multiple times. They decided not to prosecute due to me not wanting to testify. I was a little nervous at the time. And so he flipped it in family court, and I fought it. I was like, I don't understand. And that led to me actually having to be in the criminal court system because
Uh,
I would not
I
take
get
the.
it. So as I understand it, so oftentimes we would run into this in the district attorney's office. There would be a restraining order against someone. And in fact, to violate that is a criminal act. It's a misdemeanor in general just to violate it. So oftentimes a restraining order says you're not even supposed to call them on the telephone. You're certainly not supposed to go to the house. But what would happen oftentimes, many times, and I call them victims, didn't realize, and particularly when they had a child in common, that by the victim calling up, I call it the perpetrator, that in effect that nullified that restraining order because there was supposed to be no contact. So oftentimes people, so the police would arrive at the scene and ask, okay, what happened? And many times leave and say, well, the restraining order is no longer in effect because you are the one that made contact with that person. And so that's why it's critically important for people to understand if there's a restraining order, what those bounds are. And I will say that in some cases the 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 perpetrator, the boyfriend or whatever, in some cases it was the female, would, okay, we're getting along. Okay, come over and let's have dinner. So they would come over and have dinner, and for a week or two everything's fine, and then it blows up again, and then they call and the police come out and say, well, in effect it's no longer in effect because you invited that person back into your home or wherever you were, and that's a real problem in the system. And I think it's a problem that has to do with educating people when there is a restraining order, what it means, what it
Mhm.
means. Anyone else have a similar experience with a restraining order where those kinds of issues came up?
So personally for me, my I was 15 and in a very abusive relationship, and where he stabbed me, he broke my collarbone, he threw me out of a car, and it actually came to a point where my eyes were literally bleeding, like I was crying tears of blood. And so I went to the doctor's office the next morning after a huge situation that happened the night before, and they said, well, what's going on? And I said, oh, I just woke up like this, true. Victim survivor response, and they said, no, well, hold on. So I waited for about 20 minutes, and then an officer came in, and he told me that he was filing an emergency restraining order, and that if I had violated that in any way whatsoever, if I contacted him, they would take my daughter from me. And so that is actually what prevented me from trying to fix it. I had handprints all over my neck. I had bruises all over me. So there was no way that I just woke up like that. And so that
Or
was
didn't
how
work.
that restraining
Yeah.
order
Or
worked for
didn't
me
work.
in my
Yeah.
case, because they
Because
threatened to
that, I
take
mean,
my
it's
daughter.
not true.
I
I don't know why the
mean,
officer would have said that to you,
yeah.
but I mean, clear enough, and all of you can probably tell us stories about the idea that people are afraid. So sometimes we find, let's say, in a husband wife, where the wife doesn't work and she's outside the home. She works very hard, but she doesn't work outside the home and depends very much on the husband, and is terrified that if he's in jail, guess what? Are we going to lose the house? Are the kids going to be lost? So there are so many things, but and I think we've done much better in terms of having people counsel you and say, here, no, this is what's going to happen in that. But I think oftentimes the police come up. They oftentimes look who has bruises on them. That person's going to jail. There's very little discussion. And certainly telling somebody, look, if you violate this, we're going to take your children away from you. So who's going to listen to that and not believe it if a police officer comes, particularly if you're 15 years old? That's
I was a teenager at the time, yeah, and so I believed everything that they told me. So it
so has that changed?
it
So
I
I
left
think we'll
that day
all
and I
talk
never
about a
looked
little
back.
something that's happened, but
So
is there, Sarah, your thoughts? Do you think is the system changed at all in your experience, or are still the same problems that we're seeing, in spite of the fact that we have domestic courts and we have restraining orders, and hopefully police trained a little better in how to approach these things? What do you think?
I think there's very little training in domestic violence and what it actually looks like. So, domestic violence is a wide range of issues, right? So, it's not about, and as Annabelle was speaking to, there's physical violence, which is very apparent, very visual. But I think most violence actually starts in the coercive control family of violence. And I think many of us have experienced that as survivors. Coercive control has
mhm.
myriad manifestations, and a lot of it is emotional, it is financial, it is psychological. And that is something that's not actually acknowledged by law enforcement, not by at least the ones that I've met, the district attorney's offices. They really want to see some physical violence evidence, and they really want to have witnesses. So, what we find with domestic violence is that often it's done behind closed doors, right? So, there are no witnesses, right? It's you and your
Mhm.
perpetrator. And so, when law enforcement shows up, if you call them, because it's really not safe to call them, right? Because your perpetrator most likely has told you if you call, things will get worse for you or
Mhm.
your children, which was my case, right? So if I called, he would move to the children, right? So it's really not a scenario you want to enter into. So I think that we don't have training, not appropriate training anyway. And when you then move into domestic violence court, which I agree with you. There are domestic violence courts now. However, if you have children involved, most likely what they'll do, which is perhaps what many of us have experienced here in this room, or many other survivors, is that they will roll your domestic violence case into your custody case. Okay, so it's an actual term, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's something that
I
many of us
am.
experienced. Okay, so right,
Yeah.
rolling into, and when you hear it, right, as a victim in PTSD mode, right, with young children who have been perpetrated against, most likely, or at least have witnessed violence against you, then you say, okay, right? It's going to be rolled into something that's going to actually come to fruition in some sort of justice. But unfortunately, that's not what we see. It's not what we see in the family court system. And I think all of us here on this call, and I'm sure hundreds, thousands of us across the country have also experienced that.
I don't disagree, and I will say that oftentimes when the police show up, it was the concept. When I headed the unit, believe it or not, when I first started in the district attorney's office a number of years ago, if the police arrived and let's say one or the other had bumps and bruises, and clearly there was a fight and clearly there was some physical contact, the police would ask the one who had the bumps and bruises, do you want to press charges? And in many cases, then they were terrified. The last thing that they wanted to do was have this person, so they would say no. Or they would say yes, the person would be arrested, and at the time it was a misdemeanor, and taken away. And then when court came, and I would be at court with them, and they say, I want to drop everything. I just want to drop everything. And of course, obviously, why? Terrified. Terrified for everything that you've talked about that so far, everyone. We haven't heard from Nicolette yet, but we will pretty quickly. Terrified they're going to lose their kids, they're going to lose their house, or they're going to be beaten again. So that all changed. And it got to the point where the law changed, where when the police arrived, the person who had bumps and bruises, the other person was going to jail. It created a little bit of a monster, honestly, because there was no discussion. And it could be that the perpetrator was the one with the bumps and bruises because somebody was trying to defend themselves. The police would just say, you're going. And it took complete discretion away. They didn't want to have a conversation. You've probably heard that before. Nope, not interested. Yep. You got bumps and bruises on you or cuts or whatever, you're going. And I think we're still kind of in that mode. I want to say that discretion has been completely taken away from the police. They just say, we'll leave it to the district attorney's office. We're going to write the report, we're going to take the pictures, we're going to do whatever. And that's kind of the end of it. And the victim says, well, okay. Because you often would see that somebody had a bruise and maybe they got it in the garden that day. Guess what? They're going to jail and the other person is not. So I do appreciate, and I know when Sarah, you talk about training, that training is different. But what are you to do as a police officer? And that's what I want to talk about here a little tonight. Caitlin.
I wanted to add real quick, just in personal experience with police officers, that the first time in my situation, for instance, I do believe that the arresting officer had very good training. And the reason why was that when he came in, he was assessing everything. He was very analytical. I could tell he was. And he took time to have, and this was the first and only time I've seen good training with the police officer. Because my ex had been arrested multiple times. But he stopped, analyzed everything, had full conversations with both of us, and could tell that the fact that I was standing outside in the middle of January in Sacramento, which gets pretty cold out here, with my toddler, she has no bottoms on, she's just wearing her diaper, crying, and my ex is sitting in the house talking about how she's the crazy one, she's the crazy one, she's the crazy one. The police officer literally told me, he does not put you and your child first. Even the fact that you're standing outside to wait for us because you are that fearful to be inside, and he is sitting inside warm and cozy and talking about how you're the crazy one, I immediately could recognize that you were the victim, because you would not be standing out here in 45-degree weather with your child. And he was assessing it, and I could appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, certainly there are going to be some good stories, and I think we want to talk about the good and the bad. We want to talk about, because the idea is, how do we fix this? So Nicolette, you started an organization, tell us a little bit about that, because obviously then the reason for it, I don't know, never seen it before, but it is to address some of these issues and try to fix it in some way. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and your experience.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for inviting us and letting us speak about this very important and much needed resource. I started Are They Abusive based on my personal experience in the courtroom about 2 years ago. I requested a restraining order against my then ex who had assaulted me and threatened my life. And during that hearing, the bailiff handed the judge a previous restraining order that was filed on him by an ex-girlfriend. That did not show up on the multiple background checks that I did when I had first met him. And long story short, it took me about a good year to get my hands on those court documents after I was granted a 3-year restraining order. And I found that he had assaulted her to the point where she ended up in the hospital. And that's why I decided to create something that shows the public if someone has a court-filed permanent restraining order that is public record. But what's frustrating is, like Sarah said, my restraining order now is not public. It is given an FL filing, not a DV. So whoever he has met since has no knowledge of his multiple restraining orders, because he also changes 2 initials in his name. And I feel that that's unfair, because it gives the impression when you run a background check, nothing comes up, yet this person has a history of arrest, a history of assault. And that puts us, the public, in a position we're not able to make an informed decision on who we allow into our homes, our children's lives, our workplaces, if we want to hire someone. And that's unfair.
Well, it's interesting. And I think it's a wonderful concept, because clearly I have friends that are PIs that are often hired to do the very thing that you're talking about, to run a background on somebody for a business, or even somebody that they're dating, hiring somebody. I know of a couple of cases where a parent hired this PI that I know to do a background check on the man that was dating his daughter. Just let me know. And as a matter of fact, the background check missed the fact that the guy was on Megan's list. So don't know how that ever happened, but I got the story through the father who had hired the PI, and he was quite distressed because his younger daughter just went on Google and Googled on Megan's list, and bingo, it popped up that this guy was on Megan's list, but a background check through a PI didn't find that. So I can tell, incredibly frustrating. How do you know, and particularly in our world of privacy rights, how do you know? In the domestic violence realm, goodness gracious, how do you know if this person, Nicolette's experience has? So what have you, tell us what you found, or what stumbling blocks that you've run into in setting this up, in gathering information. Is this something that by hard work, by dint of work and research, somebody could do? Or is it something we need to talk to the legislature and change the law and find out that no, this is something that needs to be out there? Nicolette?
It definitely needs to be out there through the Senate and Congress. I have reached out to a few people that I met through connections. I have not heard back yet. It definitely should be a public resource. I don't think that domestic violence abusers, especially where evidence is fact, should have any privacy rights. I feel that if you have been found with evidence that you have abused someone, why do you have rights? I mean, sex offenders don't have rights. I mean, why are we protecting domestic violence abusers? Why are they given custody? Why does the court system want to just go through cases like cattle and say 50-50 custody, get along? That's not fair, because abusers raise, statistically speaking, not in all cases, but Then in the case of what happened earlier this year in Sacramento County, where the father, who was restrained by a 5-year restraining order in the same court that I'm in, and the mother told the judge the same thing that I've told, he's dangerous. He killed their 3 daughters on a supervised visit.
Well, you know, it raises lots of issues, and we need to explore that. I want to say that privacy, everybody gets privacy whether they're on death row or not. But an interesting concept, and I was thinking just as you were talking about it, is that if you are on Megan's list, then that is published. So I would think, and you and I will have to talk about who you spoke with, and because we certainly have some contacts in Congress, and that if somebody is actually convicted or held, there is an actual restraining order against them. So let's go back and say how this works, as you all know, and just for our audience, that in order to obtain a restraining order, you go and make an application with a little affidavit, and you sign it, and there's a TRO, a temporary restraining order, is then issued. You have to have a friend or somebody go serve it on the person so that they're noticed, and then initially, usually it's about 30 days out from the time that you filed it that there's a hearing. Sometimes it gets continued by agreement, but in place in that temporary is that person who is served can't, if all the boxes have been checked, they don't get to harass you, they don't get to call you on the phone, they don't get to. Now, when children are involved, sometimes in their custody issues, there can be an agreement in the document that the court allows in the TRO that there can be an exchange or anything like that. But there are limits, so that kind of puts them, in fact, even they have to turn in their weapons. So that's, and then we fast forward to, let's say 30 days, let's say the hearing, and the person who is served doesn't show up. In that case, then the court normally enters a restraining order, which can be for a minimum of 3 years, sometimes 1 year by agreement, but usually it's 3 years, and sometimes as much as 5 years. Then that restraining order gets filed, usually with the police departments in where the perpetrator lives, where the victim lives, and perhaps in a couple other counties where they work. So it's designed. Is it perfect? No, because sometimes it's in a county that the person goes on vacation, commits all kinds of acts, it's not on file. But there are ways. So in general, that is how it works. I would think, just like Megan's Law, and perhaps that's where we need to talk to the legislature, that if somebody can be put on a Megan's Law list as a child molester, that somebody who is involved with domestic violence and has been found, so that restraining order has issued. It's past the TRO time. You showed up in court, you put on the case, and the court found it to be true. I would think there would be in some fashion, the ability to determine that is, in fact, that there is a restraining order, and not hoping that the bailiff has looked in the system and given it to the judge. Because I'll bet you a lot of bailiffs haven't, no fault of them, but a lot of judges perhaps don't know about restraining orders in other areas. But I think it sounds like you've talked to some people, but nothing has come to fruition yet in terms of what can we do and how can we get this out into the public realm. Fair enough, Nicolette?
Yes, and Megan's Law, sexual abuse of a child, is domestic violence.
Yeah, and Megan's Law can be, it can be. I headed the unit that we did that. It can be a lot more than just sexual abuse of a child. There's an awful lot in Megan's Law, and I know when we bought a house, I want to say my wife and I about 10 years ago, and we had, a 10 and an 11-year-old. I would have done it anyway, but we actually went on Megan's list to look in our town to any people that were listed, and believe it or not, there were some that I was very surprised, the neighborhoods, and then it turns out somebody had died, somebody had moved, and it was an old list, but at least it gave you a sense that, okay, you know where to go and where not to go, and alerted you to the fact that somebody is paying attention to that. Domestic violence it is, I want to say, so pervasive. It really is. And as I think as Sarah said, and you all agree, it's much more than just beating somebody up or twisting their arm or pulling their hair. It's verbal abuse. It's all kinds. It's all kinds of things. It's even threats. That I'm going to take the kids, or I'm going to do. I mean, there's so many things that it encompasses, some of which wouldn't get into a restraining order, and that's the difficult part. But I think I'm looking at 4 different pictures, and I'm thinking each one has raised an issue which is significant, and each one which is slightly different, and each one needs to be addressed. And I'm not saying about you each personally, but just the issues raised. And we go to Nicolette, and you say to yourself, okay, I'm a dad. I have a daughter. I have a son. I don't know where. I mean, the days are long past where you just totally trusted. And no, nowadays I think you want to know. So what do we have about employment? So many times now you can't ask somebody if they've ever been convicted of a felony, but many companies, and I coached, and in order to coach down here in Contra Costa County, anywhere now, you have to go live scan, and your prints are sent to DOJ, and they want to say if this coach is listed on Megan's list or as an abuser or anything like that, been convicted of anything, and they have to make the choice. So we have that ability. Now that is ability that if you want to coach, you have to go through it. If you don't want to go through it, then guess what? You don't have to coach. So I don't know how many domestic abusers would say, sure, I'm happy to live scan and put my name in the system. But we do know that if you have a restraining order against you, it goes to DOJ, and your CI&I call it the rap sheet, it's on there. It's on your rap sheet. And that means but that's not open to the public. That's not available unless the person consents. So I think we're trying to decide, how do we find out? Now, can you go down to the court? Let's say here in Contra Costa County, you can go into the criminal court, clerk's office, and you can give them a name. And if in fact there is a criminal case on that person, it's listed. They can tell you. And you could actually look at the file. You can't look at the police report, but you can look at the file. So, yeah, Nicolette.
I actually contacted the Contra Costa court and gave them a name, and they sent me the entire restraining order and the police report.
Interesting. So did you do it online and they sent it to you?
No, I actually had to speak to the clerk over the phone. I had to send them a check. And so restraining orders in California are public record. Now, in states like, I want to say New Jersey, they are not public record. And the states are not interconnected. So if an officer is going to a home in one county or state, I forgot what they said, but I know that he explained to me in their system, it will not show if the person they are going to confront has a restraining order outside of the area. And that puts our officers in a position of getting killed, which happens. We hear it on the news. And it all comes back to domestic violence is not public, and it should be public. It saves the public. It helps prevent more victims. It helps the police officers who are called out to DV calls. And I mean, I don't understand. It's a win-win situation.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think with Caitlin, did you raise your hand? Somebody else wanted to. Oh, there we go.
I just wanted to add to that scenario, and actually it was a real scenario for me. I had filed a restraining order on somebody that I had started seeing because he started displaying like severe signs of abuse towards me. He hadn't been physical as of yet, but it was starting to that point, and he did start threatening my life. So when I filed the restraining order here, I was living in Rockland at the time. The restraining order, when it was filed for Rockland, but I went through the Placer County courts. So it hadn't yet been processed fully. We were still waiting for a court hearing. And he actually came to my house and he opened up all of the windows and all of the doors downstairs just to show that he could get into the house. And the law enforcement that came said that they really couldn't do anything about it because it hadn't been totally cemented yet in that restraining order. So, and they didn't have proof that it was him. However, I had text messages, I had saying that he was going to be there, and he was going to show to me how easily it would be to get into my house. And at that point, I felt so unsafe. And just like we stated earlier, that's just a piece of paper to some of these perpetrators.
Well, that is a problem. So, yeah, in that case, I mean, there was a TRO, but the final hearing is so that TRO should have been in place, and that officer should have. Now, I could understand from a proof standpoint if the officer's saying, "Well, I don't know if it was him. You don't know if it was him." You say, "Yeah, I do. I know it was him." But I could see and I'm certainly not here to bash the police. I have a daughter who's a police officer, and I think she does such a good job with people, has such a good connection, but each person is individual in spite of the fact that I know Sarah's talked about lack of training and all that, and that's a huge issue. But you're going to find some people want to work a little harder than others, some people want to dig in a little more than others, and some don't. But no matter what, there's the frustration with, I know it's him, he opened up all the windows, what can I do? If you found this information about domestic violence interesting and helpful, stay tuned for our next episode of No Holds Barred.